think we might make a start, even though people are still coming in, so we can keep the day moving along. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Laura Harper. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Architecture, and I'm the convener for the 2019 Annual Design Research Conference. It's my role today simply to guide you through the events, and we're honoured to have Pabanata Carolyn Briggs AM here to give the welcome to country. So I'll hand over to Carolyn now. Thank you.
Good morning. What a beautiful day it is today. I'm just having technology skills. Wow, it's all about design, and welcoming here is about designing a welcome to you on this beautiful day that we call Perith. So, in the language afforded to me, it's Womanjiga, Marambik, Bunurong, Namda, Barupton, Ata, Willem. And it is about that welcome, and it is about Womanjiga, and it means come with a purpose. But I also like to pay my respects to other Indigenous peoples and fellow countrymen, and talk about share this idea or this concept of what, to me, is that understanding what means Womanjiga. And as a descendant of Melbourne's first people, we'd like to welcome you. And Womanjiga is come with a purpose. You come, ask to come, and what is your intention for coming? This land we now stand today is a part of the traditional country of the Yuluk Willem people, the people of the river. Yuluk means people or place. Willem is home. And with the other clans, a part of the Bundjalung language group. The Bundjalung people were a part of a much larger nation or confederacy known as the Eastern Kulin. The Bundjalung and the Woiwurrung have a unique history and culture, and we are pleased to be able to celebrate that with you today. The word, like I said, Womanjiga, come with a purpose. So you always have that as a mind. It's not just a welcome. It's about you connecting to people and place. Is a part of the Bundjalung language group. Traditionally, the Bundjalung and the other clans from the Eastern Kulin would meet to celebrate and to trade. Great celebrations were held each month to celebrate the coming of the new full moon. The descendants of the Bundjalung and the Eastern Kulin have continued to take an active and progressive approach to leadership and protection of our values. Just like Womanjiga, it is one more way in which we can acknowledge and celebrate our shared histories and heritage. In traditional society, the Eastern Kulin were committed to the maintenance of our society by valuing the importance of learning, showing respect, celebrating life, and honouring sacred ground. This importance of learning has been a transmission of knowledge and understanding that ensured our culture survived. This commitment has been a part of every generation since time began, and one of the reasons why we are still strong. We believe that you must respect the past in order to understand its future. Showing respect in our traditions, visitors are always welcomed, but they are required to show respect to the Wurrungi, the laws of the land. This is the same way we show respect to each other's diversities, cultures, and religious or spiritual beliefs today. And we are here to celebrate this evolution of change and design and bringing things trying to bring them back to what the beginning and understanding that we had. This was our ways of knowing, our ways of being. And it is about that celebration of life, the arrival of new children, the coming of the 6 seasons, and visiting the neighbouring clans was very much an important part of our traditional life. We talk about respecting sacred ground. We should all acknowledge the sacred ground on which Caulfield now stands, and it's also a host to many people from many different nations, and we still call upon them to continue to respect sacred ground by understanding the laws of the land and that creation of that laws. And it's about that commitment, or that dambal, that you must acknowledge that you are on a presence of something bigger than yourselves. I don't know how you imagine 2,000 generations before you. It's a long history, so it's about that reimagining and rethinking what was before, what has contributed to where these sort of structures now lie, the house of learnings. So when we have that understanding, the Wurrungi Bik, which means laws of the land, and it is my hope that we can all take pride in this, our shared history, and celebrate the strength of this great nation of ours. And it's according to the laws of this land. It will continue to be protected by our creator, Bundjalung, who travels as an eagle, and by Wan, who protects our waterways, travels as a crow. Bundjalung taught us to ask all guests to understand, to make a commitment. And there you are, to obey the laws of Bundjalung, and that is not to harm the Bik Biks, not to harm the Warranis, and not harm the Bubups, our lands, our waterways, and particularly Bundjalung's children. This commitment is made through an exchange of a small bow dipped in the water of the land. So once again, Warmanjika, Murrumbik Bik, Bunurong, Nurmderb, Barupton, Ata Willem. So we're going to go and explore all these journeys and challenge ourselves in this new way of thinking. Nungujin.
Thank you, Pabanata Carolyn. I would also personally like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would like to introduce now our first keynote, Professor Brian Martin. Oh, sorry, I just skipped over Shane there. Shane, I'm sorry about that.
It wasn't my fault. It was actually a test for Brian.
Shane, sorry about that. Professor Shane Murray to give the Dean's welcome to the conference.
Thanks, Okay. Good morning and welcome to MARDA, Monash Art, Design and Architecture. Our faculty is absolutely delighted to be able to host this really important ADR conference, Real Material Ethereal. I would also like to acknowledge and thank Pabanata Carolyn Briggs for her really generous welcome to country. I also welcome today's 3 keynote speakers. I'm not sure whether I should still welcome Brian, but our MARDA's Associate Dean Indigenous, Brian Martin, Professor Laura Lee, Advisor to the European Climate Knowledge and Innovation Community, and Associate Professor Yoko Akama from RMIT University, and we're really grateful for the contribution they are making today. I also acknowledge the efforts of the University of Sydney in setting up the first ADR conference. This is only the second conference, as most of you know, In particular, Professor Matthew Atchison and Dr. Sarah Breen-Lovett, who I'm now delighted to say are members of this faculty. And I'm also grateful to them for participating because, as some of you may know, they're really under enormous pressure as they and their colleagues work towards the final deadline for their Building 4.0 CRC, which was successfully shortlisted to second stage but is due for delivery in a couple of weeks. I particularly want to thank the ADR 19 conference team, our great head of architecture, Professor Naomi Stead, conference convener, Dr. Laura Harper, conference team, Corinne Ryan, Alison Fairley, and Georgia Novak. And I'm sure most of you would imagine what enormous effort has gone into the presentation of this conference and the production of the very ambitious conference proceedings which you will eventually receive. I think Real Material Ethereal presents a broad and generous format for the exploration of current tendencies in design research. A few of you would be of my vintage, but you may remember the rather tendentious discussions that used to happen around this idea. I think it's one which demonstrates a new confidence in the framing of design research and one which enables us to recalibrate our thinking around design research as it relates to both a transforming academic or university context, but also to complex and challenging transformations in the world around us. I invite you to really engage with and enjoy the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane, and I'm now going to welcome Brian Martin to give our first keynote. Brian is from Bundjalung, MuruWarri and Kamilaroi ancestry. As a practising artist, Brian has been exhibiting work nationally and internationally for almost 3 decades. His research investigates the relationship of materialism in the arts to an Indigenous worldview and Aboriginal knowledge framework and epistemology. Brian co-authored the Australian Indigenous Design Charter and International Indigenous Design Charter, which I believe you're going to talk about today a little bit, which provides culturally appropriate principles for designers and practitioners working with Indigenous people. After his keynote, Brian will join the discussion panel addressing the nature of design research, which will be chaired by Shane Murray and will be joined by 4 other panellists as well. So welcome, Brian.
Just to make it a little bit more romantic. Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. I too would like to acknowledge country. So, Nigay Nyama Garagin Pabanata Caroline Briggs, AM. Nagala Na Yungan, Nagala Gara Mala Yungan, Wananana Mala Guru Gala Yungan. Nagala Wana Janga Mala Yungan, Nagala Na Mala Yungan. I said I pay my respects to Pabanata Caroline Briggs. I call Auntie AM now. And I said we belong to this country, we look after this country, we don't do wrong around this country, we don't harm this country, we belong to this country. Nigay Nyumba Garagin Bunurong Yungan, Nadangyang Gali Bundjalung. I show my respects for Bunurong country and extend that respects, of course, to Bundjalung, the great ancestor of the Kulin nations. Banyamuna Brian Martin, Nagangali Dilarong Guroi, Bundjalung Yungan. My name is Brian Martin, and I pay my respects to the great ancestor, Didarong Guroi of the Bundjalung country. Before we start, I'd just also like to acknowledge and state that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers of this presentation are advised that this does contain images and works and practices of peoples who have passed into their spirit dreaming. no offence is intended, and we pay our respect to our peoples who have passed into their mirup, or spiritual dreaming. What I've presented to you so far is the premise of respect and context, and in context of Pāpānata Caroline Briggs. We've already presented design and relationality, which is premised on country, in this case Bundjalung country. It's premised on place. Relationality is also based upon positionality. Therefore, this is why I position myself as a guest on Bundjalung country. Indigenising design commences with place. The place is here. However, we need to unpack how design has been detrimental and harmful to Indigenous peoples. Design has been disrespectful to Indigenous peoples and others, anyone of non-European heritage. The title of my talk today is Indigenising Design, a Matter of Relationality. What does indigenising design mean? What does relationality mean? In this presentation, I'll unpack these two things in particular, and by doing so, reveal what is vital to follow protocols in order to build relationality, which in turn reconfigures the premise of coloniality. The protocols we'll look at today, of course, are the Indigenous Design Charter. There are two, the Australian and International Indigenous Design Charters. So for us to understand why these terms, indigenising and decolonising, come from, we must regress and define what colonial design and thinking was about. And we're going to do this to build a deeper understanding of why it's important for all people to look at reconfiguring, decolonising and indigenising design and thinking in general. I need a drink of water. I propose that the main purpose of the colonial project was design predicated on two particular things, and this is disregard and self-regard, and this is something that Uncle Greg Harrington, Uncle Charles Moran, who are Bundjalung elders, and Professor Norm Sheen articulate in On Country Design. So firstly, in order to put into context the colonial, let's look at what was being colonised and reveal the design of Indigenous ways of knowing. It is here that we look at Indigenous ways of knowing that are premised on relationality, and will unpack what relationality means. And I'm only going to do this briefly because it's very hard to sum up a few 100,000-year history in half an hour. So basically, when we look at, and Pāpānata Caroline Briggs did talk about Bundjalung. I spoke to Bundjalung Kamilaroi, who are creation ancestors. And when we think about relationality in Indigenous ways of knowing, everything is predicated on law, but law is premised on place. And place is something we carry with us. So although some of us may not be on country, we take country with us as well. But that relationship to country that we bring is in the place that we're on today as well. In particular, for example, I might use Bundjalung as an example. Bundjalung would have, in creating the Kulin Nations, and as Anna Caroline stated, outlined all these various laws that governed how society would have operated. And this whole society was premised on relationality, our kinship relationships to each other, who we can marry, who can have relationships with, how we learnt about land, country and so on. What's really important about this notion of place and country is country and place has a living subjectivity. You know, in most Aboriginal languages around Australia, we don't have words that describe land. We have words that describe country. You know, in Bundjalung, Jurin Bijima talks about country. It's a matriarchal link to country that we have. So country has agency. I won't go into all these things, but basically our society built on relationality was about, for example, how we learnt, managed land, our spirituality in land, environmental knowledge was taught by elders to younger people. You know, these things were taught day in, day out. There was no separation between design, visual practice and life. You know, if we were all sitting around today, you know, Pāpānata would be teaching us all about country, drawing in the sand, and so on as well. But then, say tomorrow, we'll go enact that theory and actually go live and map country in that way and build that relationality. So that was really important about our society. The way our health was governed as well by, you know, a couple of people who would be in our clan group would be people not of this world, who'd moved between worlds. And they were people who could dish out tribal law. They were also people who looked after the general health and well-being of all people. Our group responsibility was really important in terms of our relationship to each other. A clan group could be anywhere between 300 to 500 people or more. If one of those people left this world or went somewhere else or was shamed and ousted for some reason, that changed the dynamic of the group. So this is why we're unpacking this notion of relationality in design. This is design through relationality. And still today, we talk about our roles, relationships and obligations to each other. When you're an Aboriginal person, when we meet, we go for a cultural dance. Who is your mob? We look at the gender of the person. Who are they related to? Are they married? Do they have children? Who are their cousins? Are they parents? What is their totem? What is their skin group? Is the person an initiated member of a community? Is the person an elder? All these aspects of an individual person articulates the relationality that you have with them. This is design through relationality. I want to explain this a little bit further in terms of practice. So when we look at design, practice, and relationality, here's an example of a great artist, Uncle Badger Bates, who's Barkindji, originally from Wilcannia in New South Wales. And this is an example of relationality in design practice and design in general. This work, Partnu Daliet Witi Witi, which is cod eating yabbies, is about the ancient story of the Barkindji who receive their skin name according to different seasons of the year when they go fishing for cod. So children around the ages of 8, 9 or 10 years old, I'm sorry, the slides have actually moved on this for some reason. They go along the Barker, being the river, the Darling River, and when they catch a cod, they open the cod's stomach, take all the giblets out, and take away the swim bladder. And behind the swim bladder is a membrane that follows the spine. And when you take that membrane out and lay it down on a clean surface, it forms the shape of a tree. Now, children will go along the Barker, the river, and find that same shaped tree. And then elders will say that's where that cod was born, along the Barker. Barker being river, Barkindji are people of the river. And so children will get that skin name which articulates the Partnu, the cod, the Barker, the river, and also the season of the year. So these things are interconnected. I was fortunate to be with Uncle Badger when he carved this, and it's from memory. So he's actually carved this into lino. He doesn't see himself as a printmaker, he calls himself a carver. This, Indigenous ways of knowing about relationality, this relationality can be explained through our connection to country, which, as I said, has a living subjectivity. Place has its own agency. And this is designed, again, through relationality. It's the same with language, like the term yulka, which is a Wirragaya Wodjabalak word, meaning to paint. We don't have words that translate as art or design in a way. We've got these words that are about doing it, about thinking and making. They're verbs. In the various other words from Yagamba, which is one of the dialects of Bundjalung, and which is Mibala Gumlan, which actually translate language of men or sound of eagles. We've got these various words. Bulga, which means to make, to build, design, construct. Yagamich, which actually means to build as well. For example, you can say Nyayu Bagana Yagala, which means I can make a boomerang. Not I made one, I can design it. It's about this predictive sort of thing. Bulgur, which actually means good. Bulgala is good place. And then we have words like Gangjul, which means your shoulder, but also means a tree branch or birds of a bird's wing. Jarang, which is also tree branch, thigh of a person, or a meeting point of two rivers. So you can see that interconnected relationality with country, with language, with people. There's no separation. And the last word, my favourite word in Bundjalung, is Bundjali. And Bundjali actually means, it's a beautiful word, means the rain comes, but it comes from Budgie, which Budgie means to strike. So Bundjalung means the act of rainwater hitting the surface. Rain is more than just water. It is a sound and experience. It is experiential, and this is relationality. So once again, this is design through relationality. So this is a very brief, very brief overview of a relational system. And we're going to just move quickly into the colonial project and see how this holistic relational system was affected, and the introduction of new law, the shifting relationality in this rapid change of colonisation. We have to remember that this came out of 18th century European thinking, out of the initial stages earlier, from the Age of Enlightenment to the Romantic period to social Darwinism as well. It's where races were ranked according to so-called perceived intelligence and so on. So what was the design of coloniality? And as I said before, it was premised on these two terms, disregard and self-regard. So one thing that in particular happened around all parts of Australia was, for example, we were moved on to missions and reserves. What that did is when you move someone off place, move someone off country, and people weren't allowed to speak their own language, we started to lose that notion of relationality as well. You know, that loss and disruption of personal identity. Our whole system, for example, as I said before, being taught by Parbanata about country, you know, if we were separated, we no longer learnt about this country because we would have been moved across the state, interstate. Sometimes people were moved to other countries as well. So it became quite complex. And all these different things, that's why we have, you know, when we look at things like poor health today, forced dependence on introduced foods and so on, you know, how we dealt with conflict. Our law system shifted dramatically. You know, our whole system of relationality shifted. And this is a design project of disregard and self-regard. Some first impressions when we look at Dampier and Cook, you can see, you know, of here, you know, the inhabitants of this country are the miserablest people in the earth, of the world. They have no houses and skin garments, no sheep, poultry and fruits of the earth. And Cook, from what I have seen of the natives of New Holland, they appear to be the most wretched people upon earth. But in reality, they're far more happier than we Europeans. They live in tranquility, which is not disturbed by the inequality of condition. The earth and sea of their own accord furnishes them with all things necessary for life. And we can see in here this whole notion of, I just spoke before about this notion of the Romantic period, social Darwinism. There was a whole hierarchy of races that was created out of social Darwinism. And in that hierarchy of races, we have, of course, Anglo-Saxon male, followed closely by Anglo-Saxon female, to the various European races, to Asian races, to down the bottom was what was termed Africa's Negroid, so an African person, and then primates. And underneath primates was the Australis Negroid. So we've got to remember this whole project of disregard and self-regard was premised on the fact that we didn't even have one step on that evolutionary ladder. And this is what's complex about the formation, a bit of history here, in the formation of Australia under the banner and assumption of terra nullius. And terra nullius meaning, under Roman law, land belonging to no one. Because how can these things running around own anything? Because they weren't human. And so this is the project of, design project of disregard and self-regard. And much of the mapping of Aboriginal societies in the 19th and early 20th centuries was an integral part of the colonisation process. And it was carried out principally through the alienation of our lands. You can see the Victorian nations here. And the relocation of our peoples to government missions, government and mission administered reserve communities, as you can see some of these here. And for Indigenous communities, a range of utilitarian buildings, homes, missions, institutions and churches retain strong, albeit sometimes troubling associations and bear deep, harmful historical traces. And as I said earlier, people were moved, and this is just in Victoria. You know, there's a lot of people who, Bundjalung, for example, from the Horsham area where Ebenezer Mission were, who grew up on Lake Tyers and Gunai Kurnai country and so on. So people were shifted around. You know, we all heard of Archie Roach, who grew up in Framlingham, who's good in Chamara, but he's also Bundjalung as well. So people were shifted and moved as well. And under this banner of assimilation, as you can see here, there was a whole ideological premise of assimilation in Australia for about 100 years, but as a specific designed act in 1937, you can see here the destiny of natives of Aboriginal origin, but of the full blood, lies in their ultimate absorption by the people of the Commonwealth. So this is what gave rise to what we of course know today as the stolen generations, but there was a very interesting way to look at this notion of how the colonial project designed on disregard and self-regard, in particular with the Assimilation Act, because we can compare what was happening around the world at the same time, especially in Germany in 1937 as well. And this is why I said at the beginning of the talk, when we're looking at images of deceased people, I mean no disrespect here, this person is actually my second cousin, who I refer to as my uncle. This slide articulates the colonial project of disregard and self-regard, and you can see here we had the opportunity, I'll say that in inverted commas, to actually hand in our Aboriginality. We can become exempt from living on missions and reserves. You can see with this certificate here. To leave a mission or a reserve, an Aboriginal person had to carry their certificate with them. If they did not carry their certificate with them, they would be arrested. And as you can see, this is 1956. Same with this one here, this gentleman here, you can see the different conditions that the exemption certificate carries. You know, walk freely through town without being arrested, enter a shop or hotel, and it says you may or may not be served. And these things were quite important in the Aborigines Protection Act. The special conditions that apply, speaking of native language, prohibited. Engaging in dance, rituals and native customs, prohibited. Associating with fellow Indigenous people, including family, prohibited. And that was in particular, when we talk about this notion of the colonial project being designed and premised on disregard and self-regard, you can see that's really defining indigeneity, and if you're handing those things, you're handing in your indigeneity in a way. And I'll just bring your attention to the second last line. It says, this is your chance to be free of the Aborigines Protection Act and live like a white man. So this, once again, is the design project of disregard and self-regard. Very similar to that notion of eugenics as well, the hierarchy of races, and also this notion of blood quantum as well, and what gave justification, and how this was designed with the notion of assimilation was designed to obliterate indigeneity as well. I'm going to briefly move and look in these instances in visual practice and show some examples before I go into what a brighter future holds. This has been a bit glum, but we need to look at these sort of things. And I want to look at how this project of design project of disregard and self-regard was enacted in the field of creative and visual practice. And there's an interesting dialogue of representation, and we won't go into representation because that's a longer conversation, of Aboriginal people in Australia, in Australian visual practice, particularly between 1850 and 1900. And in particular, in this era, there was a decline of the frequency of which we were represented in mainstream academic art in the decades, particularly preceding the Federation in 1901. And the figures of Aboriginal people formed a significant presence in Australian painting from the moment of first contact in the late 18th century until well into the 19th century. Paintings of the Australian landscape, as well as portraiture and figure studies produced in the second half of the 19th century of images of Aboriginal people were used to signify the primordial difference of the Antipodean landscape. This uncolonised landscape represented the antithesis of colonial civilisation, both spatially and temporally distinct from the colonial nation. And prior to Federation in 1901, Australian national identity was dependent upon the recognition and construction of a difference that was seen to be implicit with the Australian landscape itself. And this sense of difference derived from the settlers' perception of the Australian environment and became embodied in those colonial objects, which appeared most different from settlers' notion of familiar. Colonial artists drew upon an iconography based on this recognition of difference. We can see in this work with John Glover how this was portrayed. Paintings of Aboriginal people set amidst idyllic Australian landscapes, or the happy coexistence of settler Australians and Aboriginal tribes on whose lands Europeans had built their farms and stock runs, formed the subject of Australian art at this time. And this was at a time when Aboriginal people were being displaced from the landscape, from country, and from our traditional lifestyles that were disrupted through this project. There was a renewed effort to replace and repopulate Aboriginal people after years of concerted effort of eradication. And something I didn't go into earlier were the numerous massacres, but that's something to talk about another time. And this renewed effort to replace and repopulate Aboriginal people was, these works, in particular, John Glover, Samuel Thomas, here, the native dignity. These works promise a false consciousness in a contrast to the real colonial experience of dispossession and displacement. This is a design project, once again, of disregard and self-regard. And there's numerous other examples where the representation of Aboriginal people can be symbolised equally, both a colonial Aboriginality and at the same time the colonial transformation of the landscape in which they're located. In this work, you see there's two figures parading around in the cast-off clothes of white society. With her sassy grin, the man is apparently oblivious to the spectacle which he is part of. The significant thing here is it reminds us that the body underneath can never be quite white. This, again, is a design project of disregard and self-regard. And these works are a demonstration of this notion of novelty and a construction of the continued folly of otherness, and this notion of representation as well. And this is, again, the design project of disregard and self-regard. And then we see this shift, as I said earlier, just before Federation, in William Ford's Picnic and Hanging Rock. When we look at Aboriginal figures in paintings of the Australian landscape with settled Australians, suddenly there's this reconfiguration of this notion of the wilderness. There's a new and intimate relationship between Australia's colonisers and the landscape they occupy. This work demonstrates that this occupation has somewhat deleted the wilderness and has created a civility with a new landscape. We suddenly disappear from the landscape. In particular, Frederick McCummon's On the Wallaby Track can be also seen in this work. It becomes nostalgic. The creation of Australian nationalism, a new birth, a new non-Aboriginal future. Once again, there are numerous examples of this strive for a national identity pre-Federation up until 1901. This is the design project of disregard and self-regard. So how has this also played out when we look at the onset of appropriation? Some of you remember what this is. It's a $1 note in Australia. Shane remembers what this is. Yeah. Shane still uses it? No, I better not push it. I think I've got... Does anyone work at RMIT? I've got to look for another job. So in February 1966, Adelaide's advertising newspaper revealed that the Reserve Bank had not sought permission from the celebrated Arnhem Land artist David Mullangy when it reproduced his work on a new $1 note. It is adorned with 3 examples of Aboriginal art. In the top right, stick-like hunters known as mimi figures, derived from some of the cave paintings in Western Arnhem Land on Yolngu country. Below are the figures of the kangaroo, goanna, and a snake rendered in the X-ray style. It's also taken from rock art in Western Arnhem Land. The rest of the design is a copy of a bark painting from Eastern Arnhem Land, which actually depicts the mourning rites of Yolngu people, which is this work here by David Mullangy. There's one small problem. The artist who produced the painting was very much alive. His name was David Mullangy, is a Yolngu man from Arnhem Land. Malungi, ironically, Malungi had been a de facto member of the Currency Note design group, but no one had thought to let him know or pay him that they were using his design. Everybody seemed happy, and history records Malungi henceforth proudly went by the name Dollar Dave. But were Malungi's cultural rights respected, and even more importantly, his human rights? And did Malungi even own copyright over his own painting? Recently uncovered in archival evidences raises troubling questions about the real nature and settlement Malungi reached with the Reserve Bank. This is again the design project of disregard and self-regard. We see this work here by Mans Tillers and titled Terra Incognita, which dislocates Emily Kamilaroi work, Big Yam Dreaming, as not only in its physical appropriation but by its title. Terra Incognita means land unknown, where Big Yam Dreaming is about her dreaming, which is premised on country and place. And as we discussed before, our ideology, our relationality, locality and country are the basis of our culture. And Tiller's title here is an affront to the traditional custodians of country. And it's through this structure that the work engenders amnesia through covering up and covering over a country. And as such, the work may be viewed as an act of colonisation, another form of terra nullius. This is the design project of disregard and self-regard. So, from here, in terms of what we've been looking at in the notion of trajectory of disregard and self-regard, Norm Sheehan provides some thoughts to us. He states, what must never be stated, however, is that these identities are not only constructed to marginalise and control Aboriginal communities, they're also constructed to conceal aspects of the dominant culture that may expose it as unworthy. And this is where he talks about this imagined moral centre. He says, arguably, the main reason for the construction of these identities and this project of design of disregard and self-regard are that they are needed to conceal the real culpability and ignite the imaginary moral centre of the dominant group. It's about concealing the past and its consequences in the present to preserve the imagined morality of the dominant group. It is about identifying the moral centre, that the moral centre is about shifting disregard and self-regard. And this is what has now become the decolonial project. And decolonisation is a concept that takes on different meanings across different contexts. It simultaneously evokes a historical narrative of the end of empire, a particular version of post-colonial theory, a way of knowing that resists Eurocentrism of the West, a moral imperative for righting the wrongs of colonial domination. Decolonisation empowers people to reclaim, rename, rewrite, and asserts that decolonisation is not a formal administrative term, but rather a restructuring of subjects of history into agents of history. It is in this context that things like education operate as well. Education operates as a site for colonial power. This is why pedagogies themselves have been responsible for the reproduction of colonial hegemonies. And this is why there's this whole strive across Australia and Canada and New Zealand to decolonise things like curriculum. So how do we navigate this complex space? Martin Nakata suggests that we need to untangle ourselves from colonial histories. So how do we do this? I propose that the Indigenous Design Charter sits ontologically in what Nakata calls the cultural interface. And it's a framework that can promote identity that is mutual, interchangeable, and according to context, and differ according to audience. There is a problem with having one definition. That's what the colonial project does. According to Nakata, who's Torres Strait Islander academic, the cultural interface cannot be viewed then in deterministic ways. It is a space of possibilities as well as constraints, which can have negative or positive consequences for different people at different times. The Charter is premised on relationality and furthermore place. So why does this Charter exist? How was it formed? The way it was formed, the International Indigenous Design Charter, was formed with a group of myself, Jifa Greenway, Russell Kennedy and Megan Kelly, took the Australian Indigenous Design Charter and took that into other communities in Canada, New Zealand, Greenland and Sweden. And we met with different types of communities and actually ran workshops which articulates the Indigenous Design Charter in its current state. So it's about building relationality with other First Nation peoples globally as well. And it's a document that's constantly growing and moving and shifting. And despite the existence of protocols for creation, distribution and ownership, the International Design Charter responds directly to identified needs to address these concerns at an international level across all disciplines. And this overturns the notion of disregard and self-regard because it is premised on relationality. It's about indigenising design. The International Indigenous Design Charter can help facilitate accurate and respectful representation of Indigenous knowledge in all disciplines of design and associated media. It moves beyond design, though. It's about thinking as other spaces. So it's about remembering that, we're not viewing the world as, visual art, design, architecture, this, that. It's all making, it's all this notion of design thinking. And so this, once again, is about overturning the notions of disregard and self-regard. The Charter also reinforces the rights of Indigenous people to achieve self-determination, as recognised by the United Nations in their Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The UN Declaration describes the rights of Indigenous peoples to maintain, control and protect and develop our cultural heritage, traditional knowledge and traditional expressions of our cultures, including designs. The Charter is a cultural innovation tool to be used by designers to explain the benefits of authentic cultural representation to their clients, for example, and to help them understand the process required when engaging Indigenous knowledge and cultures in commercial practices. I'll briefly go through the 10 principles. The first principle is Indigenous-led, and that's to ensure Indigenous stakeholders oversee the creative development and design process. The International Indigenous Design Charter clearly states Indigenous peoples have the right to oversee the creative development design process of design work that seeks to engage with Indigenous knowledge production. The Indigenous Design Charter asks designers to engage with local Indigenous designers who are connected and traditional custodians who are connected with the relevant communities to provide opportunities for them to oversee the creative development and design process, and also to employ Indigenous staff or consultants where possible. The second principle, self-determined, is respect the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine the application of traditional knowledge and representation of their culture and design practice. The International Design Charter reinforces the rights of Indigenous peoples to cultural self-determination as recognised by the United Nations. Community-specific, ensure respect for the diversity of Indigenous cultures by acknowledging and following regional cultural understandings. Designers need to develop a cultural awareness to recognise the sensibilities and diversities of each Indigenous culture. It's about being local. Remember, it's about place. It's about country. This includes acknowledging the diversity of Indigenous cultures as represented in urban, rural and remote communities. Designers need to understand they may only be given information or knowledge when the community has established trust and is prepared to share. Once again, it's premised on relationality. Deep listening. Ensure respect for culturally specific personal engagement behaviours for effective communication and courteous interaction. Make sure to be inclusive and ensure that the recognised custodians are actively involved and consulted. It is recommended designers start a conversation with the intention to learn, not to teach, and demonstrate the practice of being courteous, patient, and listen deeply. Listening deeply is listening ontologically, it's listening with everything. Designers and their clients need to develop dedicated research practice methods for Indigenous themed projects and be aware of the budgetary impact associated with such considerations. Things take time. Indigenous knowledge, acknowledge and respect the rich cultural history of Indigenous knowledge, including design, stories, sustainability and land management, with the understanding that ownership of knowledge must remain with Indigenous custodians. The rich cultural history of Indigenous knowledge is a living entity that continues to evolve. By developing a cultural competency framework, those engaging with Indigenous knowledge remain aware of the complex cultural reality that regenerates, advances and grows. Shared knowledge, cultivate respect, culturally specific personal engagement behaviours for effective communication. This involves courteous interaction to encourage the transition of shared knowledge by developing a cultural competency framework to remain aware of Indigenous cultural realities. The Charter recommends designers have patience to cultivate respectful, culturally specific personal engagement without undue pressure. Ensure the appropriate cultural custodians and knowledge keeper are present when consulting or co-creating. Demonstrate open, transparent and inclusive consultation processes. Ensure all stakeholders understand that consultation may require an extended period of time. Understand it is important to collaborate from the outset of the design process rather than seek approval at the end, and that's quite a common thing. Share and disseminate information and any findings with relevant Indigenous stakeholders and engage with courteous interaction to encourage the transmission of shared knowledge. Shared benefits. Ensure Indigenous people share in the benefits from the use of their cultural knowledge, especially where it is being commercially applied. The Charter encourages designers to share the benefits of the commercial outcomes with the traditional owners of cultural knowledge. Impact of design. Consider the reception and implication of all designs so they protect the environment, are sustainable and remain respectful of Indigenous cultures over deep time, past, present and future. The Charter asks designers to ensure the representation of Indigenous cultures reflects their cultural values and respects their customary laws, protects and respects the environment and honours the values of Indigenous cultures, are an authentic reflection of Indigenous knowledge, empowers Indigenous peoples past, present and future, and positively impacts Indigenous peoples who are both the subject and producers of the story, past, present and future. Legal and moral. Demonstrate, respect and honour cultural ownership and intellectual property rights, including moral rights, by obtaining appropriate permissions where required. Designers must be aware of their professional and moral responsibility and the need to understand the power they have to influence opinions. For this reason, the Charter emphasises the importance of respecting copyright and moral rights. Finally, the Charter implementation asks the question, is there an aspect to the project in relation to any design brief that may be improved with Indigenous knowledge? Use the Charter to safeguard Indigenous design integrity and to help build the cultural awareness of your clients and associated stakeholders. So this brings us to the end of this talk. And the Indigenous design charters are best practice, not only in terms of working with Indigenous peoples, design, images and practices, but it is a great and significant tool for all types and forms of design, practice and making in any field. This is a new design project premised on regard and relationality. In Bundjalung, there are no words to say thank you. We don't thank people. So if you remember the word bulgul, bulgul means good, Bugala is a good place, and finally Bugalwan, which means to wish you well. So I wish you well, and I must leave you with this image because I found this the other day at that climate strike. I thought this was pretty amazing. Anyway, so thank you very much.